Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would break down one of the fights that is going to be happening this weekend. And I believe this is the main boxing fight that is going to be happening this weekend. If there is another boxing fight on, I do not know of it. So, if there is any other boxing fights, someone let me know of it. But the other fight overall that I may break down, of course, is going to be the main UFC fight, the main mega heavyweight fight I believe, for UFC, whatever number it may be. And of course, that's going to be between Francis Ngannou, who is the current UFC heavyweight champion of the world, and the interim heavyweight champion, I believe, Mr. Cyril Gane, or Gan, however he pronounces it. But anyways, I'm going to be breaking that down a little bit later on and telling who I think may win that fight. But anyways, just to break this fight down between Mr. Gary Russell Jr. and I believe this Philippine fighter right here by the name of Mark Magsayo, when it comes down to the fight, if I'm pronouncing his name right. This is a very interesting fight that's going to be happening this weekend. Mr. Mark Magsayo, I believe. I believe that he is one of the top contenders at that division. I believe that Gary Russell Jr. does compete at the 126-pound division. This is going to be a very, very interesting fight. The last big fight that I've seen Gary Russell Jr. in, I guess if you want to count it as a big fight, was the Jojo Diaz fight. And Jojo Diaz at the time, when it came down to it, I believe that he actually was undefeated and he was an up and comer. And I thought that, Jojo Diaz, I think that he's always been very decently talented. He's a decently tough fighter. But Jojo Diaz in his biggest fights, and he did this both against Devin Haney and Gary Russell Jr., he's just not a person that's willing to risk it in big fights. He's not a person that likes to get hit. He won't throw in the biggest of exchanges. He's a person that's defensively responsible, but he's almost a little bit too defensive. So Gary Russell Jr., even though I thought that it was a very, very good performance, I don't really think that he was very heavily tested in that fight because Jojo Diaz, especially if you're a very physically gifted fighter, if you're a person that has a decent skill set, he's not really going to test you to your ultimate limit, in my opinion. Now, in that last fight against Devin Haney, I do think that he gave it a competitive run. I actually thought that he hurt Devin Haney a couple times. I thought, all in all, that he looked somewhat good, but like I said, you have to be willing to risk it to get the biscuit. And there's certain fighters, all in all, when it comes down to where they're just afraid to get countered and they're afraid to throw back because they're afraid of their opponent's abilities. In order to win a fight, you cannot be afraid to do that. You have to be willing to exchange with your opponent, and you have to be overall, like I said, be willing to risk it to, get the biscuit. Well, I don't think that that is necessarily going to be a problem for this Filipino fighter, Mr. Mark Magsayo. But when it comes down to it, or however you pronounce his name, just in case I'm pronouncing it wrong, but Mr. Mark here, when it comes down to it, I do not believe that he is going to beat Gary Russell Jr. That is, if the best version of Gary Russell Jr. is going to come in for this fight, I did a Oscar Valdez versus Shakur Stevenson breakdown. I believe I posted it earlier today, and I had someone in my comment section that said, "Oh, well, you say that Shakur Stevenson wins, but I have Oscar Valdez, and you know why that is? Because Oscar Valdez has the heart of a warrior, and he fought once upon a time with a broken jaw." And I think that it is great overall, to have a lot of heart in the sport of boxing. I think that it is great to be a warrior. But being a warrior only gets you so far. Because a lot of the times when you're in a big fight with someone else, especially that may be on the same level as you, they may have the same amount of heart as you. They may have the same amount of toughness and grittiness and all in all the same will to try and win. Take a look at Deontay Wilder versus Tyson Fury, for example. Deontay Wilder has some of the most amount of heart that I've ever seen a boxer have. Deontay Wilder would rather die in the ring and fall on his shield before he ends up getting the fight stopped. That's why he was so upset with his corner, Mark Breland, I believe, or his one coach, Mark Breland, in the rematch against Tyson Fury, and he fired him because he was so embarrassed that his corner would stop it, and he said, "Why would you not let me fall out of my shield?" Certain fighters are willing to do that. Certain fighters are not willing to do that. Listen, I believe that Mark Magsayo, I believe that he will be possibly trying to make it tougher than what a Jojo Diaz was. What I'll say is this: Mark Magsayo, he does have real decent power. He has a very excellent left hook, all in all, that he could possibly hit Gary Russell Jr. with. Gary Russell Jr. does rely a lot on his speed. He does rely a lot on his athleticism, but he is a very gifted fighter. When I take a look at him, I think that his fundamentals are very good. I think that his feet are very good. I think that his head movement is very good. His hand speed is good. The only thing that I would say about Gary Russell Jr. is that sometimes he needs to keep his hands up a little bit more, especially after certain exchanges. The main punch that actually both fighters should look for in this fight, I actually think, is a series of body shots and the right hook. Now, Gary Russell Jr., I believe that he is a southpaw. He loves to counter with that right hook, and you'll notice with a certain amount of southpaws that they love to counter with that right hook. Such fighters like a Gary Russell Jr. or a Mr. Shakur Stevenson. I mentioned that in my Oscar Valdez video as well. So Gary Russell Jr., he has a very fast, very quick right hook. But the thing also about Gary Russell Jr. is that when it comes to his right hand, sometimes all in all, or not his right hand, excuse me, but his left hand, sometimes he won't keep it up all the way always. So even especially after he may land a right hook, he can be vulnerable to a right hook as well. Because there will be certain times all in all where he does not necessarily keep his left hand up as he much needs to. That, like I said, that is a problem with Gary Russell Jr., at least in certain times. When I seen that one fight against Vasily Lomachenko, one of the main counters that he was able to get him with was that very good and very swift right hook. And it hurt Gary Russell Jr. a couple of times in that fight. And that was one of the main punches that Vasily Lomachenko was able to get. Mark Magsayo also might be able to land a left hook on Gary Russell Jr. if he's able to time it correctly. But I would say that the right hook, in my opinion, is more what he should look for, just because Gary Russell Jr. has a tendency to keep that left hand down. But we'll see what happens. He could overall land the left hook. It could be very, very interesting. But Mark Magsayo, in my opinion, early on, just like what Vasily Lomachenko did to Gary Russell Jr., because Gary Russell Jr., of course, only has that one loss in his career, and it was a dominant loss, in my opinion, against Vasily Lomachenko, because Vasily Lomachenko really showed in that third fight, I believe, how talented he truly was. But Vasily Lomachenko, in my opinion, the way that he was able to beat Gary Russell Jr., Vasily Lomachenko is just a completely different animal than what a Mark Magsayo is. I've heard a lot of people, compare this Filipino kid to the next Manny Pacquiao. And I just really don't see why. I mean, I think I know why people do that, because whenever they see a great Filipino fighter, just like they see a great Mexican fighter, they say, oh, this dude's the next Juan Manuel Marquez, or the next Eric Morales, or the next Canelo Alvarez, or the next Chavez. But, they may not fight that similarly. One thing that made Manny Pacquiao special, almost actually very similar to Vasily Lomachenko as well, is that the type of angles that they'll really go in on you. And on top of that, Vasily Lomachenko is an A-grade athlete, meaning what? He has A-grade speed, he also has A-grade timing, A-grade accuracy, and every punch that he lands on you, it hurts. Now, of course, Mark Magsayo, he does have very decent power, but I just don't think that he has the hand speed, I don't think that he has the angles, I don't think he has the head movement, and I also overall don't even think that he has the punch resistance for that weight division of a Vasily Lomachenko. The one big fight that I've seen Mark Magsayo win was against Julio Ceja, who I believe is a Mexican fighter. I remember Julio Ceja having a very, very tough fight with Guillermo Morgan until Guillermo Morgan, I believe, hit him with a wicked left uppercut and ended up knocking him out. If it wasn't a left uppercut, then I think it was a right hook, but I can't necessarily remember. I'd have to watch it again. But he was giving Guillermo Morgan a very, rough time for his money. He actually was giving Mark Magsayo a great amount of trouble as well. And one thing I noticed about that fight is that Mark Magsayo also is very vulnerable to a body attack as well. Both fighters, in my opinion, are going to have to go after a body attack early, because both fighters can somewhat be vulnerable to a body attack. But with Gary Russell Jr., you're really going to have to swarm him. The only fighter, of course, that we've ever seen beat that of a Gary Russell Jr. was that of a Vasily Lomachenko. But a lot of people really lose confidence against Gary Russell Jr. early because he's so quick, because he does have decent punching power. He's like a smaller version, but like a quicker version when it comes down to almost of Shakur Stevenson, although I would say that they're a little bit different when it comes down to. But Gary Russell Jr., he relies a lot on his speed. He relies overall a decent amount on, he does have very decent skills though as well. Let me not just say that he's someone all in all that just relies on his reflexes. You can tell that he's extremely talented. He is a person that is very, very gifted with a great boxing skill set. But if you're going to rough up Gary Russell Jr., if you're going to beat him, you have to rough him up early. And Mark Magsayo, I think that he's going to try to do that. But I think that all in all, I just think he's a little bit too slow for Gary Russell Jr. Now, the decent chance that Mr. Magsayo has is that Gary Russell Jr. has not fought in a really long time from what I remember. I don't believe that he fought in all the year 2021. So it should be very interesting to see how Gary Russell Jr. is in this fight. Gary Russell Jr., he may be a little bit rusty. So if Mark Magsayo, if he can get to him early, get to that body, throw a good left hand to the body, maybe throw a good left hook upstairs, hit him with the right hand, when it comes down to it, a right hook especially, while keeping your hands up, going in there. You may be able to hurt him, you may be able to drop him a couple of times, and maybe you may be able to win the fight. But if Gary Russell Jr. shows up in tip-top shape, I just highly doubt it. I think that Gary Russell Jr., I think that he has better punch resistance than this guy. I think that in terms of power, maybe I would give the Filipino the slight advantage, just taking a look at it, on the surface. But I'm not really sure. Gary Russell Jr. has a great amount of power as well. Gary Russell Jr.'s fight plan, in my opinion, it should be to box circles around this guy. You are going to have to stand your ground here and there, and you may even be able to back him up eventually, because Mark Magsayo, like I said, he does not like a body attack. You can go ahead and take a look at that fight against Julio Ceja. He does not like a body attack. And Gary Russell Jr., if he does go, full Gary Russell Jr. on him, or if he does overall go to the body early, he actually has a very decent chance of stopping Mark Magsayo. Julio Ceja, actually, it seemed like he was able to almost stop Mark Magsayo, but Magsayo overall was able to come back with a very decent combination. It's not that I don't see Magsayo overall as a talented fighter, but I just don't see him as an A-grade fighter. I don't see this guy as a legitimate threat towards anyone who is going to have an A-grade skill set. And Gary Russell Jr., he is a person with an A-grade skill set. But what I will say is this. After this fight, I'm really hoping that Gary Russell Jr., that he is able to get a very, very big fight, no matter what the fight may be. Whether it may be Shakur Stevenson or, I heard that once upon a time a Devin Haney fight was possible, or maybe against a couple of other guys. Now, Gary Russell Jr., he is naturally smaller than those guys. So it, kind of like Vasyl Lomachenko, it would be difficult for him to move up, to those weight divisions and be super duper successful. Because some of those guys, they're very great athletes. And on top of that, they may outreach you or outweigh you by a decent amount, just like they did Vasyl Lomachenko. But when it comes down to it, Gary Russell Jr., let's say this, I would love to see him face the winner of Shakur Stevenson versus Oscar Valdez. If that fight actually does happen, that would be a very interesting fight. But, of course, I believe Gary Russell Jr., he's with Showtime, he's with the PBC, so I'm not necessarily sure how much that would work, or I'm not sure if that's really a realistic fight that would happen next, but it'll be very interesting. But I'm hoping Gary Russell Jr., that he's able to get a couple of decent wins on his record, or all in all, when I say decent, I'm talking about debatable A-grade wins. Not just the Mark Magsayos or, the Julio Cejas or, those guys. Because when I take a look at Gary Russell Jr.'s resume, I mean, he has that very good win over, Johnny Gonzalez. But besides that, and I guess Jojo Diaz, but none of these guys, in my opinion, are really A-grade fighters. Maybe Johnny Gonzalez at the time because, of course, he knocked out the undefeated Abner Mares. But when I just take a look at his resume, I mean, really, the only complete A-grade fighter that you really fought was Vasyl Lomachenko in his third professional fight, and you got thoroughly embarrassed in that fight. So we'll just see all in all what happens with his career. But I like Gary Russell Jr. I think that he's a very talented fighter. I think more than likely that he will win this fight, and I think more than likely he should win this fight dominantly. And Gary Russell Jr., I would actually like to see him stop this guy, because I think all in all that Gary Russell Jr., just in almost every facet of the imagination, I think that he's just pretty much more talented than this guy in every category. To be honest with you, I think that he has better punch resistance. He may have around the same amount of power. He has more speed when it comes down to it. I just think that he's all around the more talented fighter. And when people take a look overall at Mark Magsayo and they say, oh, this dude's the next Manny Pacquiao, I don't know why so many people always try to compare certain Filipino fighters to Manny Pacquiao. There's never been a Filipino fighter like Manny Pacquiao. When you take a look at Manny Pacquiao at his best, for those of you actually that want to see Manny Pacquiao at his best, go ahead and take a look at Manny Pacquiao versus Timothy Bradley. Go ahead also take a look at Manny Pacquiao versus Juan Manuel Marquez in the third fight, or in a couple of those other fights. Now, some of those fights are very decently competitive. But when it comes down to it, Manny Pacquiao, Manny Pacquiao, when it comes down to it, the thing that separates him from usually other Asian fighters is his movements, his working of angles when it comes down to it, his hand speed, not only his very gifted athleticism with his punching power, but even Floyd Mayweather Jr., who I thought decisively beat Manny Pacquiao, when he talked about Manny Pacquiao, you could tell that he had the utmost respect for him. And he basically said, you know what, I can see why Manny Pacquiao was the greatest fighter that I ever defeated. Because of the way that he moves, the angles overall that he tries to hit you at, you almost don't know where the hell he's coming from. And Manny Pacquiao, another good thing about him as well, and this is why I also kind of compare him actually to Vasyl Lomachenko to a degree, because when it comes down to both Vasyl Lomachenko and Manny Pacquiao, whenever they come in with their offense, they're always, their head is always off center when it comes down to it all in all. They're basically always trying to get in there, and get their offense off, but their head is always off center. They love to work off their jab. Sure, they have excellent hand speed and, they have very good punching power, but the head movements all in all and the positioning and, shooting at certain angles, that's what really sets up a certain amount of the great offense. And I just don't think that Mark Magsayo has that. I think that he's a person that is going to come at Gary Russell Jr. very straightforward. I think that he's going to try to bruise him up early. I think that he's going to try to knock him out. I think that he's going to figure out that Gary Russell Jr. is a little bit slicker than what he thinks. And I think he's going to, see that Gary Russell Jr. also can punch back. And I think once he figures that out, I think all in all that more than likely Gary Russell Jr. should more than likely outpoint him very decently easily. But we'll see what happens. But it'll be very interesting to see how this fight goes down. Mark Magsayo, of course, he is a person that is undefeated. So we'll see what happens. But anyways, that's pretty much my prediction for this. We'll see what happens, and I'll talk to y'all later.